Contender or pretender, we'll tell you how to evaluate your roster as we get closer to the fantasy playoffs. All that and more in this episode of the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast.
You are Locked On Dynasty Football, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day. Here are your hosts, Marcus Mosher and Kate Madjuk.
Welcome back to the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We'd like to thank you for making us your first listen of the day. This episode is brought to you by Prize Picks. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use promo code LockedOnNFL to win $50 instantly when you play $5. Welcome back. I am your host, Marcus Mosher. You can follow me on Twitter at Marcus_Mosher. Joining me today, as always, is Kate Madjuk. You can follow her on Twitter at Kate Madjuk. On today's show, we're going to help you evaluate your dynasty roster to help you decide if you're a contender or a pretender, plus all the moves that you need to make as we get closer to the fantasy playoffs. Okay, let's first start off with the idea of how do you know when you're a contender versus a pretender in your dynasty leagues?
Here's step one. Look at your record. I know that's like the most basic thing, but look at your record, see where you fall in your league standings. Do you have a chance at the playoffs, or are you clawing for a place in the playoffs? Like, do you have the little asterisk already because you started the year 8-0 and you know the rest of your league has been kind of floundering? Great. You're a contender. If you are not a lock for the playoffs or not looking like there is an easy pathway for you to make the playoffs, this is when it's time to decide, all right, this is when my assets are going to be most valuable. I'm going to shop those assets to one of those contenders along the top of the league standings, and then you start your rebuild. And this is kind of the most crucial time. Your players will never have more value than they do right now for those people who think that they are about to win a championship. So this is crunch time, y'all.
I would also say, look at your points scored. I know I'm in a dynasty league where I believe I'm either 5th or 6th out of 12 right now, but I'm number 1 in points scored. Just some really unfortunate luck just based on who I played each week. That's a team that the roster is really good. The record hasn't shown it yet, but I think if things continue, I think that team will eventually be within the top 3 or top 4 records. So I'm looking at a combination of points scored and your record. Okay, there's also a situation where your team is the flip side of that. You have a really good record, but your points aren't high. Maybe you're 5th or 6th in points. What do you do with those teams where it's pretty clear you're going to make the playoffs, but you know that your roster is maybe not good enough to be the favorite?
What I like to do in that circumstance, and let's just be honest, if you make it to the playoffs, especially if you secure that first round bye, absolutely anything can happen. We analyze fantasy to death, but it is also a game in luck, and injuries can affect the game. Like, so many things go into whether or not you have a successful final 3 weeks of the season, right? So if you get to that playoff spot, obviously that's important, but having context as to what your chances are, I think you really need to just thoroughly examine the rosters of your opponents. It's not just about your roster here. It's about what you're going up against. So let's say you have a team right behind you in the standings. You're number 1, but your points scored aren't that high. You got maybe some lucky matchups, and you're looking behind you. And, there's a player at 7-1 right now who's about to get Christian McCaffrey back, who, maybe has like a DeAndre Hopkins that could have this second half surge. You need to look at your opponent's rosters to see like the context of their performance as well. And see, are they the real deal? Or, I think part of, evaluating your standing in the league is also taking a really good look at the rest of rosters in your league for all the context you can possibly gather.
Yeah, and I want to kind of go back to the point of once you are in the playoffs, you never know what's going to happen. We see, year in and year out, really strange players help us win fantasy championships. There was a year in 2018 where a 250-pound CJ Anderson filled in for Todd Gurley. And I believe he had one game in week 16 that was like 170 yards and 2 touchdowns. And in another game that was like 150 and 3 touchdowns. I remember way back in the day, Tim Hightower having a 40-point game in week 16. I remember a young Josh Allen in 2018 having a really strong fantasy playoff. So once you get to the postseason, you just never know what's going to happen. And the good owner or the good managers are going to figure out ways to improve their lineups and tinker with their lineups. So if you have a team that is projected to make the playoffs, or you are at least trending in that direction, I have a really hard time giving up on them, even if your points scored aren't very high. I think what we're talking about more for the pretenders are the teams that are hanging out, Kate, like around the 7-8 range, and their scoring is similar to that, right? Like you're not inside the top 6. You know you're probably not going to be inside the top 6. That's when it's time to move on.
I probably put my line closer like top 5, top 4, which I know sounds marginal, but when you only have, 10 people in a league, like that
It makes a
line,
difference. Yeah.
it does make a difference. Like
I guess I was
think
talking like 12-team league. Like if you're in the middle,
Mhm.
6, 7, 8, I think all those spots, again, assuming you're not like number 1 or number 2 in points scored, that's when it's time to start tearing this thing down.
Yeah, and I tend to agree with you. It's not necessarily all about just the record. I think everything, like, all fantasy advice needs to be contextualized, and your decision to either, continue rolling as a possible contender in your league, or the move to decide to rebuild is one that needs a lot of context and evaluation of not just your roster, but the rest of the rosters in your league to see, you know, how big a chance do I have to be competitive? Are my biggest competitors leaning on maybe one star player and the rest of their or the rest of their roster doesn't have much depth? Or is this, an opponent that if their top star goes down, they've got plenty of other players to just slot right into the mix without skipping a beat? Like, those are the things that matter when I'm making my decisions. If I'm one of the rosters that maybe doesn't have as much depth, and I'm looking at those, rest of the rosters along the top, and I'm seeing lots of depth, I'm seeing a pathway to, overcoming injuries, for instance, that's what's going to scare
Yep.
me. And that's probably what's going to send me into rebuild mode. So you never know. It's so much bigger than your record, points scored. It's about all of those things combined.
And we're going to talk about how to rebuild your team, but I think it's important to figure out what type of rebuild you're in. Are you in one of the rebuilds where, hey, it's just not my year. I've had injuries to a lot of my star players like Brandon Ayuk, Rashee Rice. I mean, you guys know the names at this point. Let's just trade away 1 or 2 assets to pick up more draft picks. That's like a soft rebuild. Or are you into the rebuild with like, hey,
Blow it
this
up.
roster's, blow it up. I'm not anywhere close to where I need to be. I need to sell off all the assets that I have value right now and keep some of my young guys. That is important as well. Like, because I don't think when we say rebuild, it doesn't mean sell your whole team. In some cases, it means sell Derrick Henry for whatever you can get, because he's not going to help you kind of float to the, I guess float to the bottom is the wrong word, sink to the bottom of your fantasy standing. So identify what type of rebuild you are in as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. Again, everything needs context. Fantasy football is so nuanced. Do not oversimplify your decision making here, and we're here to help you navigate that decision making, because it is tricky, Marcus. I know I'm a competitive person. I don't like conceding. I don't like giving up, and I know that there are a lot of listeners out there that want to hang on, but that's also part of being a thoughtful and
Yes.
smart dynasty manager, is knowing when it is time to back down and concede, because you're not going to be competitive this year, and it's in your team's best interest to skip back, take what assets you can for the players that no longer serve you.
All right, so let's talk about some win now moves. If you've come to the conclusion that you're a team that you think can win a fantasy championship this year, what are some of the moves that you should be making? We will get to that next. This episode is brought to you by 5 Hour Energy. Our friends over at 5 Hour Energy know that being a passionate football fan isn't just a hobby, it's a way of life. It takes a lot of energy to power through all day tailgates, touchdown celebrations, or an agonizing second overtime, which is why they've created the Stand the Fan 5 Hour Energy Shot with a special flavor called Fan Fuel, the energy shot made just for super fans like you, the fans who are first in the parking lot and the last to leave. We see you. You know what gave me a little bit of fan fuel this week? Watching our guy Tyrone Tracy just carve up the Steelers on Monday Night Football. Kate and I were big fans of him pre-draft. It was awesome to see him have a big day. So that made me feel great. You know what you should take to feel great? 5 Hour Energy. 5 Hour Energy knows that no matter what team you root for, being a fan requires heart, soul, and a whole lot of energy. Whether you're prepping for the big tailgate or ironing your favorite jersey, your game day to-do list is always a mile long. That's why the limited edition Stand the Fan 5 Hour Energy Shot is here to help you stay fueled through this entire season. Available on 5hourenergy.com, shipped nationwide. Welcome back to the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast. We'd like to thank you for making us your first listen today. We are fixing your dynasty teams. Kate, let's talk about how to win now in your fantasy leagues. How to know to go for it. What moves should you be making if you've come to the conclusion that you are in win now mode?
If you have come to the conclusion that you have a potential championship within your grasp, my number one piece of advice is to not trade for a superstar. Hear me out. Hear me out, right? Do not trade a bunch of your assets to upgrade at one position. My position at this point is depth, because those are the rosters that are going to withstand the variability, the injuries that are to come throughout the end of the season. We know more than ever, probably this year, that a season ending injury or even an injury that is a 1 to 2 week span can strike your lineup at any given moment. And for me, my best dynasty rosters are usually not the ones that have the superstar players that I traded a huge haul to get. It's usually the ones that, maybe I don't have a Justin Jefferson or a Jamar Chase, but I've got so many really good, wide receiver twos, and my entire roster is wide receiver twos at this point. Like, I think depth is so important for contenders. And usually when we think of contenders, it is rosters with some of these big superstars. But for me, depth is the priority at this point in the season.
Got it. I want to talk about trading draft picks because I think this is the hardest part. Like when we talk about win now or going all in, I know there's some people that want to just trade all of their draft picks away. I have a hard time doing that because I like draft picks. I like rookie drafts, and I want to stay a contender for as long as possible. But I'm not opposed to trading draft picks. Here's the idea that I have is I'm either going to trade my first round pick for a starter that can play right away for me, not somebody that I'm just adding to my bench because I don't think that does anything for me. I want to move that guy for somebody who immediately makes my starting lineup better. Right now, generally, Kate, I'm not setting a first round pick for anybody older than like 28 years old. So maybe let me give you an example. Do you think a dynasty manager who is maybe in the middle would trade James Cook for a first round pick?
Yes, absolutely.
And that's the type of move that I'm making, right? Like James Cook, not an old player, not a super young player, but I think he gives you fantasy value or dynasty value, obviously this year and next year. If you're looking at the wide receiver position, would you trade a first round pick for, let's say, Drake London?
Yes.
Okay.
The names that are coming to mind here are maybe some of the names that, again, not the hottest of hot names, but some of these really valuable assets, maybe that we haven't even seen like peak upside yet. I think George Pickens,
Sure.
Steelers wide receiver, is a guy that falls pretty perfectly into this category. We've seen so much of the deep play potential. We've already seen that connection with Russell Wilson. The offense seems like it's trending up. You also have a looming bye for George Pickens. The Steelers are on a bye in week 9. So looking at, some of these players that like maybe you're on some of these fringe rosters. Maybe, you can leverage upcoming buys to
Yep,
that fantasy manager and say, like, hey, look, I'm going to give you a player that has already had their buy. Here's some draft pick compensation, and you might have a ton of upside on your roster without having to pay elite prices, just
sure.
based on how you can negotiate that trade.
And so let's say you decide, hey, I don't want to give up my first round pick. I want to have that in my back pocket to continue to make my roster better. That's fine. I think that's totally reasonable. But start to move some of the other picks. Maybe you move your second round picks in the next 2 years, right? Maybe you package your second and third and maybe an older player like, I don't know, okay, like give me a receiver. I'm trying to think of somebody who's a little, I was going to say Stephon Diggs, but he's hurt, right? Devontae Adams. I move a second
Yeah.
round pick in Devontae Adams to somebody else who's contending for somebody who's a little bit better. Like I'm willing to do those trades. I don't want to give up all my draft capital, but I am willing to give up some to try to make my roster a little bit more competitive.
Yeah, and that's a great point. Finding ways to package these guys. If you are sitting at a position like you are 8-0, 7-1, go for a guy like Nico Collins, right? Stephon Diggs just had a season-ending injury.
Yep.
I hate trading for injured players, but Nico Collins's upside is legit, top 3 wide receiver finish rest of season if he's healthy, especially given that potential for volume. And, if there's a fringe player who really needs a startable asset right now and can't wait for Nico Collins's return, they can't afford to be patient. These are the types of players that I'm trying to go for that maybe aren't super serviceable to, if I'm sitting pretty, trying to find some of these guys that maybe aren't super serviceable to a mid-range or rebuilding roster and seeing what I can do with them.
I want to ask you about cashing in some assets. So again, let's go with the assumption that you're a top 4 team in your league. And then you have Jonathan Brooks sitting on your bench right now. He's expected to play this week, being drafted as RB13. Would you consider cashing him in now for another player that's maybe more established? Like, I'll give you an example. What if you could get Jonathan Brooks for David Montgomery or let me give you straight up because they're being drafted right next to each other. Jonathan Brooks for Derrick Henry right now.
If I'm a contender, absolutely.
Okay.
Here's the thing with like a player like Jonathan Brooks. Dave Canales seems very, very steadfast that they want to take every precaution necessary with Jonathan Brooks to make sure that he is totally ready to go. And he's already missed a very good portion of the season. I know like the skill set is there, but he's already missed so much of this season. We know sometimes it takes a little bit of time for these players coming off of these major injuries to acclimate. And then you add in the fact that he's acclimating to the pros. Then you add in the fact that Chuba Hubbard has been playing really, really well. It's not like they're starved for something at the running back position, right? Like
Right.
Chuba Hubbard has given them the luxury to not need to rush Jonathan Brooks back to the lineup. I think that's a great example of a trade. I mean, Derrick Henry, I think, top 3 rest of season pretty easily at the position. So, yeah.
Yeah. I've got no problem cashing in some of those assets and even some of the younger guys like Xavier Worthy, who I love, Kate. Like I think he's going to be a star in the NFL. But if you want to trade him for somebody who is a little bit more reliable week to week and give you somebody that you feel comfortable starting, for example, right now Xavier Worthy, wide receiver 24. I know this isn't a great example because he's banged up, but like if you flopped Xavier Worthy for T Higgins, just because you wanted another startable receiver, I think that makes sense as well.
My only concern with T. Higgins is the fact that he's banged up, and he
I
is
know.
one of these guys that is just perpetually banged up.
Let
But
me give you a different example. How about Drake London? They are being drafted within a spot of each other.
yes,
Okay.
absolutely. I would do that hands down. Similar upside. Drake London also just 2 years older than Xavier Worthy. Like
And
you're
now
not.
you have a receiver that you feel comfortable starting week in and week out.
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely. I think that kind of trade-off is exactly what you need to be looking for in this type of scenario.
All right, let's talk about what moves you need to make if you've come to the conclusion that you need to rebuild and tear this thing down. We will get to that next. This episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Just visit fanduel.com to join today. You'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That is fanduel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sportsbook partner of the NFL. This episode is brought to you by Bilt. Listen up, renters. Ever feel like you're stuck in this loop of rent payments, just watching your money vanish into thin air? It's time to turn that rent game around and start earning some serious rewards. That's where Bilt Rewards comes in. Bilt Rewards is absolutely fantastic. It is breaking ground as a neighborhood rewards program that hooks you up with points on your rent. Every month, pay your rent and watch the Bilt points roll in. Use your points to jet off on a dream vacation. Put your points toward a flight or a hotel stay with over 500 airlines and 700,000 hotels and properties. You can also use your points to book fitness studio classes, redeem them toward a future rent payment. They're designed to be your lifestyle. Pay rent hassle-free through the Bilt Rewards app. Your rent game just got a major upgrade. Bilt points have been consistently ranked the highest value point currency by the Points Guy and Bankrate. Earn points by paying rent right now when you go to joinbilt.com/LockedOnNFL. That is joinbilt.com/LockedOnNFL. Make sure to use our URL so they know that we sent you. Join built.com/LockedOnNFL to start earning points with your rent payments today. Welcome back to the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast. We'd like to thank you for making us your first listen of the day. For your second listen, check out the new Locked On NFL show. 2 shows every single day. 1 in the morning with Tyler Rowland, 1 in the afternoon with Tony Wiggins. Our guy, Matt Williamson, pops on the Friday show with Tony. Check it out wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube. All right, Kay, let's talk about when it's time to rebuild. What do you do? Like, what are your first steps of action here?
First of all, like I think, just a good starting point. And again, I know we already kind of talked about evaluating your roster, but I feel like we were talking a lot about how you know you're a contender. One of my favorite litmus tests for knowing if my roster is the real deal, if it is something that can sustain the storm, I look at my top player and I say, what does my roster look like if I don't have that top player, maybe due to injury or what have you? If you're not happy with how that looks, or you don't think that that roster can compete with some of the other top rosters in your league, it's probably time to bow out, and bow out quickly, because you have, half of the year left, right? We're halfway through the fantasy football season. And again, your players that might have some win now value for some of these other guys, like a Derrick Henry, who might not be a long-term option, even though he seems to be like the bionic bunny that just never quits. Like, looking at these players that you say, can I envision them on my roster in 2 years? If the answer is no, it's time to shop. And the best way to do that is by evaluating those top rosters at the top and saying, what do they need? How can I meet their needs? I know it sounds counterintuitive because they're competing in your league, but that's the best way to get trades done, is to actually look and try to find a suitable trade partner that you can benefit them, because that incentivizes them to make the trade.
Let me give you a perfect example. I'm going to tell you a roster that I have right now in a Dynasty League. 14 teams, Kate. It's currently 4th, okay? 4th overall. Geno Smith, Kareem Hunt, Zach Moss, Dontavian Wicks, Jalen Waddle, Tyler Lockett, Brock Bowers, Tony Pollard, Sam Darnold. That's a roster that needs to be rebuilt. Now, unfortunately, I've had a lot of luck. You look at like my points scored against me is like 400 less than any other team. I have no delusions about where this team is going. Like, if the current trajectory, I'm not making the playoffs with this roster, right? And it's not close enough that I where 1 or 2 moves are going to get me over the hump. this is a roster that I need to tear down. Right now, are there going to be assets in there that people want? Absolutely. I think a perfect example of somebody that you could trade away right now that's going to not help you at all is like Kareem Hunt, right? Kareem Hunt is putting up big numbers for the Chiefs because Isaiah Pacheco's out. He scored at least 20 points in 2 of his 4 starts. But what is he going to do for you in 2025? Nothing. He might not even be in the NFL. Trade him away, move some of these other assets, and start this rebuild.
Yeah, another name, Sam Darnold, who is a guy that like
Exactly.
played pretty well this season, had some ups and downs, but 2 top 5 finishes on the year. That's respectable. If you're in a super flex league and you're looking at some of the teams at the top, and maybe they could just use a little bit of depth at the quarterback position, if they're one QB injury away from their season being over, shop Sam Darnold because we don't know if he's going to have a starting job next year. He's not going to be serviceable on your roster for the years to come. And that's when it's time to say, okay, if I can't envision you remaining on your roster for, whatever reason, you're not going to have a job in the NFL, you're going to retire, you have a significant health history that you might not even be available to me on a consistent basis. T. Higgins. That is the type of player that I'm like, all right, I'm going to ship this player out, hope for the best, and just hope that there is somebody that finds them as a suitable asset to help them on their journey to fantasy success this year.
Yeah. Any other types of players that we want to mention that to move on? I mean, obviously, most dynasty managers are going to know. They're going to know about Kareem Hunt. They're going to know about Sam Darnold. What about guys that are? Let me give you an example. Jared Goff, right? Jared Goff is being drafted as QB 15. Is he going to be too good this year to help you? But maybe not good enough long term to build your dynasty or roster around. Is he somebody that you would move as well?
Yeah, I think that's fair. Another kind of idea that I would have is somebody that is just kind of like significantly outperforming their expectations, right? Like, for example, a Tucker Craft who like his 19 game pace right now. 17 game pace right now. He's on a 17 game pace for 61 catches, 901 receiving yards, and 17 touchdowns
Yep.
the last 5 games. He's a hot name on the market right now, but is he somebody that I trust long term to maintain that value? No, we talked about it yesterday. Like, this is a very crowded receiving core. There's also Luke Musgrave in the offense. Like, he is one of these guys that is kind of outperforming expectations in a big, big way. Any other names that come to mind that you think are like due
Yeah.
for some big time regression?
Well, I wanted to say this is one other strategy I sometimes use when I'm rebuilding, and this one's a little tricky, but I sometimes like to try to trade away my top end assets and just get a little younger. For example, let's say you have AJ Brown on your fantasy team and you ended up struggling the first few weeks without AJ Brown. AJ Brown is a superstar, right? He's a top 10 dynasty wide receiver all day long. But maybe the strategy here is to trade AJ Brown for somebody who's just 3 years younger, 4 years younger, that's being drafted a little bit behind him. I'll give you an example. I would trade AJ Brown for Puka Nacua straight up right now. Now I know AJ Brown's being drafted ahead of him, but if you could do that trade and get 4 years younger at the position, it's probably not going to impact you this year in terms of how many points you're scoring. It's probably going to be similar, but I think that's a way to continue to make sure that your roster doesn't get overaged.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Some other names that maybe are on the other end of that, like a Brian Thomas. If you have
Yes.
an AJ Brown trading, for Brian Thomas Jr. plus, another lower range asset, right? Like,
Or I would flip like Tyreek Hill for Brian Thomas right now, straight up.
yeah, I think that's a great example. And not necessarily just looking for draft picks, but also looking for these opportunities, like you said, to get younger at certain positions. Even if it is a 1-for-1 swap, how can you, improve the longevity of your team,
Yes.
even if you might not have a big differential in terms of points scored this season?
Because I've got to believe the Puka Nacua manager probably is not doing particularly well this year. Or maybe they are, and maybe they are interested in that swap because they get somebody who's a little bit more stable, or the Tyreek Hill one. If you just want to go out and get somebody who is 8 years younger that doesn't have the consistency of Tyreek Hill, I think that makes a lot of sense as well. That is it for today's show. We want to thank you for making Locked On Dynasty Football your first listen every single day. Check out our channel on YouTube. Download the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. We are free and available on all platforms. Follow Kate on Twitter at Kate Modjuk. I'm at Marcus_Mosher, and we will see you right back here tomorrow.